Alrighty, we'll just start recording and we'll just keep going through trial runs of an intro until we feel like we are ready, and then we'll just record from there.
I see.
Okay. So, back podcasting. I never thought they'd get me back here, but they did. Hi, my name's Dami.
Hi, I'm Brett. First time caller, long time listener.
Thanks, Brett. That was a good one. My name is Damilare. I am a 24-year-old creative of a bunch of different disciplines. But more than anything, I'm a massive fucking nerd. And I have done several podcasts in the past because I love the sound of my own voice, clearly. And now I'm finally, due to popular demand of like 3 people, getting back to podcasting. And I've roped Brett along with me.
Yeah, that's me. I was roped along. But, I too am a big nerd. And it's exciting. I'm not heard my own voice that often. So I'm curious to see how I feel about it.
I'll edit you real good, I promise. Welcome to the Woke Mind Virus. That's what we're calling this podcast. Why? Because I made a funny joke with it with a friend a couple days ago about the woke mind virus, and I feel like it will apply well to basically pop culture, more or less, like in the broader strokes. Like I am a massive nerd. I really like movies. I really like TV shows, love comic books, love pretty much anything with superheroes in it. So I watch and read a lot of stuff, and I have a lot of thoughts. Too many, some may say. But I would quite like to get better at my media criticism. I'd quite like to get better articulating myself, and I'd quite like to maybe make something out of the thoughts I'd have for free anyway.
For those of you questioning Dami's nerd credibility, he's wearing a Wolverine shirt as we speak, and I can see his Iron Giant and Castlevania posters.
Right, yeah, listen, when we get the studio... I've also got a Justice League... like the Justice League Unlimited.
Yeah, that's
fine. It's so cool, isn't
Good.
it? Listen, when we get the physical camera, when we get the video episodes, trust, it's going to be crazy. So, welcome to episode 1 of the Woke Mind Virus. Hopefully the name sticks. Hopefully the podcast sticks. We're going to be discussing Invincible, the comic book property, and now famously animated series on Amazon Prime, originally written by Robert Kirkman and penned, inked, coloured, arted by Ryan Ottley and Corey Walker, who are credited as the co-creators of the IP. I am going to begin this episode with a sort of single sentence explanation of my angle going into this, what we're going to be talking about. And the way this is going to work, presumably going forward, is that I will rope one of my friends into coming on the show with me, some other yappy nerd. I'm going to tell them, I think this thing about this comic book or TV show or movie, and then they get to tell me whether they agree with me or not. And we kind of cite our sources. Nothing too academic, just a bit of, shit posting with the boys.
Yeah.
It is.
Good. I personally like the idea of the format being it gets gradually more brain rot, so good. We're going to start off strong though, guys.
We're going to start off real strong. So, the topic sentence for this evening about I'm going to see if I can edit in the title card sound effect at that point. Yeah.
I think that's close enough.
So the topic sentence for our episode tonight is, I believe that Invincible, particularly the show, but also in the comics, but mostly the show, because the show is very much an evolution of the more subtle themes of the comics, is that Invincible presents a world where love is the antidote to fascist violence.
I see. Now, when Dami first explained this to me, I wasn't too big a fan on the Invincible show, so I've been rewatching it recently. But I can see your sort of logic behind it, but I think it takes a slightly different angle in how it sort of approaches the topic of fascism and counter-fascism thinking. So let's hear you first.
Okay, I would say that Invincible as a show articulates that love and relationships and community are the antidote to fascist violence, and it does this principally through all the Viltrumite characters, pretty much. We can see this most clearly in the most recent Viltrumites appear in the show, Conquest. And Conquest is very much the reason why I'm picking the microphone back up. You can blame Jeffrey D. Morgan for this, because I was really fascinated by the reaction people have had to Conquest as a character. The finale premiered last Thursday, so not even a week ago, and we've already had a slew of video essays on the topic of the character of Conquest. And I'm going to insert a retroactive spoiler warning for Invincible, by the way.
Spoiler warning.
I'm put that in. So, there's been a slew of video essays about the character of Conquest already as he appears in the show, because they make a couple subtle changes, but they're quite far-reaching. And I'm going to highlight two of the things I've heard said. So, you watched the episode for the first time, maybe about, half an hour ago. So I'm quite curious to see what you think about this. But I've seen two video essays that have had very interesting thoughts on the Conquest character and on the changes they might have made from the comics to the show. So, one such thing was, like the speech that Conquest gives to Mark when he's choking him out?
That particular one, yes, it's very memorable.
That isn't in the comics.
Yeah, I think that's some interesting way in characterization, though. It's like, yes. I think there's a recurring theme of, like, the self-defeating nature of a lot of these Viltrumite folks.
Yes.
God, I think it's very interesting the way they articulate that through the character of Conquest, through making him quite a character. Let's just phrase it that way.
For the folks at home, you'll have watched the show, you've read the comics, so you'll know this, because if you haven't, don't listen to this. But as you know, Conquest gets the upper hand on Mark. He's choking him to death. He's going to kill him. And then out of absolute nowhere, I will never forget watching this episode for the first time, having read the comics, and Conquest doesn't say a whole lot, and everything he says is really memorable. So I thought I knew everything he was going to say. And then, out of nowhere, for him to lean in and whisper into Mark's ear, out of nowhere, no warning, no precursor, just, I am so lonely. All the Viltrumites are scared of me. No one talks to me. No one wants to be my friend. They think I am unstable. And he just starts trauma dumping, as people keep saying. But I'll get onto the phrase trauma dumping in a second. But that speech has very much been a thing that's been taken away. I've already seen people making it into edits and TikTok sounds. That's the Invincible podcast do great work. They spoke a lot about how that monologue was their favorite part of the episode because it was so emotionally striking, such a way to deepen a character who's otherwise quite two-dimensional. But two of the video essays that I have watched have had a very interesting reaction to that monologue, where one, who's a reviewer who talks about the show and cartoons in general, said that he thought the monologue was really well delivered and really emotionally impactful and striking. And he said specifically that he thought it was all the more impressive that statement does not change anything about Conquest's character, specifically because he's aware of all of the things he's doing that are wrong, but he's still choosing to be this monster. This monologue doesn't make him any less sympathetic. So that's one example, yeah. And the key words I want you to think about there are choice. This person is saying that even though Conquest is self-aware and is clearly in a great deal of pain because of the life he is living, he's still a monster who is choosing to do these things and is no more sympathetic for this. Think about that choice. The second one comes from Georgia Dow. She is I'm not sure if she's a psychotherapist or not, but she is a mental health professional who is very popular on YouTube at Nebula for doing these psychology of insert fictional character. She's really good. I like her content a lot. And she did an episode on Conquest not an hour ago. It was really perfect timing. And throughout the whole thing, she's doing her mental health professional stuff, talking about how people who have lots of power are often very isolated. That's really normal. But she has a very interesting reaction when she gets to that scene. Because in that scene, Conquest says that they send me from planet to planet committing atrocities in their name. And Georgia stops the video and says, I don't know if that's really true to Conquest's character, that he would use the word atrocities, because he's the bad guy, and bad guys never see themselves as the bad guy of their own story, so he'd probably have this attitude that he was purging the impure or something. She says pretty much exactly that. And I thought that was really interesting because it didn't gel with the rest of the video. Because in the video, she specifically says that Conquest has no reason to lie in this moment because he tells Mark, take you to your grave. He's confiding his pain in Mark in a space where he feels that it can bear no consequence. There's no reason to lie. And yet, she still feels that him being aware enough and describing what he does as atrocities must not be the truth of his character. Because she can't accept that he genuinely thinks of himself as the bad guy.
I mean, God, at risk of introducing a little bit of brain rot a little bit too early, I personally really like the idea of Conquest being this sort of brat fascist in the sense that he's very aware that what he's doing is very horrible, but he's just sort of so caught up in the moment of it. I think that really sells the fact that he's sort of the mindset of these people, of the Viltrumites, is quite narcissistic. They are smart enough to recognize the horrible things they do, but they're so they can so motivated by their sort of power and they're just loving of the use of it. They just sort of keep doing it.
I think brat fascist is a great word.
Brat fascist.
It really sums up Conquest really well because he's nihilistic, hedonistic, and really camp. He's
genuinely
really camp.
You cannot tell me that man does not like Elton John.
That man would love Elton John. We'll get onto music in a second. But what do you think of the reaction I've just discussed? The fact that people, including a mental health professional, someone who preaches nuance. This isn't to undermine Georgia at all. I'm just find it really interesting. As I said, I didn't feel like her statement about Conquest gelled with her video because she's at once saying that he's confiding the truth of his pain and perspective, and yet when she hears him describe his own actions as atrocities, she has to rationalize it as not the truth of his character. Because she has it's seemingly this like very strong reaction to it. In the same way as that other video essayist said that Conquest is still choosing to be a monster, therefore he's the more sympathetic. What do you think of those like really emotive reactions?
Well, I think when discussing the sort of mental psyche of like fascists, specifically ultra powerful fascists who can sort of destroy worlds on a whim, it's quite difficult in the sense of like they only use certain like words, and the rhetoric they use is very specific. It is entirely centered around the idea of power and the notion of power. You wouldn't hear them sort of articulate the words like insecurity or like sort of meaning or sort of like it's very interesting they use this word loneliness because it's like, well, the logic of the Viltrumites is an inherently lonely one. They see themselves as superior. They are alone at the top. And so I think it's really interesting the impression that he leaves of being sort of burdened by it, but at the same time entirely defined for it. He is called Conquest. He is the manifestation of the fascist ideal of asserting dominance upon other things. Mm-hmm. And he hates himself for it, or at least hates the way it treats him. He seems like a lonely fella after all.
Yeah, he does. But you've not answered my question is, why do you think the internet commentariat, the YouTube video essays community, largely had a similar reaction where they rationalize Conquest's speech in a way where he's either not being totally honest, or even if he is being honest, it doesn't change anything about his character. But mostly, people pin a lot of choice on Conquest. It's the through line of a lot of the reactions I've seen is people say that Conquest is still choosing. I'm not debating that he's choosing or not. No one except, well, Thrag actually can.
Yeah.
But no one except Thrag can make Conquest do anything.
God.
So, my question is, why do you think people, even people who are paid to and have an incredible amount of experience in, as George Lewis says in the video, not judging people and being empathetic, still have this slant towards interpreting his words in the least generous way possible?
Well, he hardly begets a trustworthy figure. I think it's hard to trust someone motivated by something as simple as violence. Because, I remember there's a moment just before in which he's sort of goading sort of Mark by licking blood and the sort of innate sort of just grossness of that. And it's like, well, you're not really dealing with someone who's motivated by anything outside of that urge for violence. I think there is an innate distrust towards like seeing that, and like the people like you can't really trust anything this guy says. He's clearly just a maniac. But I think that's what kind of makes his little death whistle sort of kind of interesting. It's like that sort of, maybe there is an air of honesty about this. I like the fact that it leaves a little bit of, like, even though he's just big guy and very mean, that they leave a little bit of ambiguity in there. I think it makes him a lot more rich with just a little change.
I would agree, but the thing I find so interesting is that we have no reason to think Conquest is lying, both in the text, because he's literally choking Mark to death and tells him to take it to his grave. And he thinks Eve is dead, so he has no reason to lie in the scene. And on a meta level, this is all new stuff. This is all new information. And the curve we've seen throughout the show as Kirkman goes and rewrites things and does new things and new people are brought on, is they make characters deeper and more interesting. So we have no reason in a textual level or in a metatextual level to think that Conquest is lying. And yes, you're completely right that, like, this guy comes across like a deranged monster, so you don't want to trust anything he has to say. But when people go past the initial viewer response and actually make content about Conquest as a character and his psychology, people still, As I said, it's the fact that Georgia says in the video, I don't want to make this podcast about Georgia Dow, because I really like her work, and I don't want to say like I'm critiquing it, but I found her reaction so interesting, because she literally says, we have no reason to think he's lying, and yet she contradicts herself by saying that him describing his work as atrocities can't be the truth of his character, because that would mean that he sees himself as the bad guy, which doesn't make any sense. I would argue that it does make perfect sense for Conquest to see himself as the villain of the story. I think that was the point of that little monologue, that Conquest sees himself as a villain, as a weapon. As he says, Conquest, he doesn't even get a real name, just a purpose. And that's where the fascism comes into, I think, because this isn't like a new point that was made by the person about to cite, but I was watching an interview with Omar El-Akkad, who's the author of, I think the book is called One Day Everyone Will Have Been Against This. It's a book about Palestine. And he talks about the destruction of language. And he cites the example of how in Guantanamo Bay, I might have told you this before, but in Guantanamo Bay, when he interviewed a soldier working there and asked about the prisoners, the soldier said, we don't have prisoners, we have detainees. And then they don't describe interrogations as interrogations, they use the word reservations. And before anyone who might be listening to this gets at me, I am using a real example to illustrate a point about language. I'm not comparing real things and fake things. But, so he uses that example in the interview to talk about how the destruction of language makes compartmentalization a lot easier. And how it's a frequent thing. You see it all the time in fiction and in real life. Like, you dehumanize people by taking away their identity and just calling them soldier, or calling them a rank, or calling them a number, and it takes away people's identity, and it makes it a lot easier for them to have bad things done to them, but it also makes it a lot easier for them to do bad things. So I think that my point mostly is that I haven't got to my central point yet. I just think it's so interesting, people's emphasis on Conquest's individual responsibility, when Conquest, as you pointed out, isn't really an individual. He's not even got a name. He is the embodiment of fascist violence. He's literally, like, his name is Conquest. Mark fighting him is him literally fighting the entire Viltrumite race. He is the distillation of Viltrumite philosophy in a single person.
I think there's something about the sort of sick glee he sort of takes in all of his actions, where it's like you said, it's strange to think that he would be conscious of how horrible the things he's doing are, because he has this clearly very elevated view of himself as a Viltrumite. I think there's something so sort of like worldly, but in a very warped way, of being conscious of it and still sort of partaking in the action. And I think with, like, specifically in reference, like, the use of language, the fact he'd say atrocity, I think it, even though, like, historically speaking, the use of words like atrocity has been famously censored by fascistic or just hostile, you don't want words like that being said. History is written
by the victors, and they always sanitize their own history.
But I think it does beget a certain arrogance in the Viltrumites as people, when in the sense, like, well, if they're comfortable slinging around the word atrocity and the fact they do it, it's just, well, there's no real way to be held accountable. Like, there's no governing body that will sort of interrogate them or sort of look into their actions. They can just throw around words like atrocity, like genocide, like lesser beings.
Yeah, so your point is that him being able to be honest about what he does, even in this moment, is a sign of arrogance, because he knows no one can check him. Like, who's going to beat his ass?
Yeah, like someone does a blog post about Conquest. I don't think he's reading it for one. And even if he did, I think he has other means of dealing with that.
Yes. I don't think you're wrong. I think you're partly right. And also, I think something that's going to be endemic of this podcast moving forward is that I'm interested in talking about fictional people like they're real. I'm interested in talking about fictional people like they are real people with lives, dreams, and histories, because that is how I think a text suggests you should take them, particularly given the nature of this one we're talking about, where Conquest talks about feelings and relationships that we will never see. You have to infer from these like 5 or 6 lines an entire life. So that's what I'm talking about here. I think Conquest as a character and the reactions to him and what he represents in the wider sort of context of Invincible and his relationship with love and violence and fascism is so interesting. And I think that it really speaks to Robert Kirkman, who actually did personally write the episode he appears in, how he's done so much with so little. Because yes, you're sort of the running kind of like counter what that you've been saying is that people don't trust Conquest and are pushed to rationalize his admission of guilt in the least charitable way possible because he takes so much sick glee in violence.
It's not just that. I think it's like the erasure of his personhood. He is Conquest. I think fascism and nihilism, and I'm going to draw this comparison. I'm not too sure, I'm not too hip with the academia, so I don't know if there's anyone else that's drawn this comparison before, but they're very similar in the sense of fascism is removing 99% of meaning from life and the universe, like the cosmos, I suppose, in the Invincible universe. And so...
In real life too, to be honest.
Yeah, they're like side by side. Fascism and nihilism have like a 1% difference in that facet. So as a singular embodiment of the urge to inflict suffering upon others, I feel like engaging with him as a person sort of is like the word person would be doing a lot of heavy lifting. Yeah, he is motivated entirely by one thing that is beyond comprehension.
But here's the thing: what else does he have to motivate him? That's my real point about how Invincible suggests that love and community is the antidote to violence. Because let's think for a second here. Conquest takes sick glee in the things he does. He relishes describing what tearing someone in half feels like to the person being torn in half. He licks Eve's blood off of his hand. He says the greatest joy he can feel is having blood on his hands. When he sees Mark you can see in the rewatch, when Mark turns to him distraught that Eve has died, he smiles then. Seeing the look on Mark's face, he says, good. This is a sadistic man. But like the society that we live in tends to look at people's behavior as a product of them first and foremost and not of their situation. People look at Conquest's incredible sadism and think, as you literally said, he's just a maniac. Conquest is a maniac. However, think about how soldiers and police and many other people who are trusted by institutions to enact violence on their behalf have been found to behave in situations. News stories upon news stories of the barbarism enacted by people who are trusted with violence by a state, right? Those people go through these processes, as you said, of having their personhood erased. Conquest doesn't have a real name, just a purpose. That's what fascism is in a sentence in a lot of ways. You do not, being a fascist soldier, you have your name taken away from you, you become soldier or private or officer or whatever, and you gain a purpose in that sense. And Conquest has nothing else but violence. Think about it, as he says, he has no friends. He has no one to talk to. And those would be friends, people to talk to within a fascist culture that idolizes violence and the ability to do domination. The friends he would have wouldn't exactly be making him better, but at least he'd have friends. We know the Viltrumites do have friends. We know Viltrumites can have feelings of goodness towards each other because I'm pretty sure in the comics Thetis talks about mourning Argyle, and we see in the show and the comics that one of the Viltrumites who is meant to execute Nolan doesn't want to do it, well, at first, because Nolan was his hero growing up. We know they are capable of positive feelings, but we also know the Viltrumites don't have games. Like, remember in season 1 when Mark...
The baseball game,
and no one doesn't respect it. But then that's a flashback, obviously. But then he grows to love it in the flashback. But then also in season 1, in the present time, we see Nolan initiating a game of catch with Mark. The Viltrumites, Debbie told Nolan about the concept of giving a loved one flowers. He gives her a whole tree. Because that's not a thing they have on Viltrum. Conquest literally says in the episode, the way they write this line is really interesting. Conquest says when Mark is mourning Eve, Viltrumites have nothing like this, full stop. It's a weakness, really, full stop. If you read that sentence, divorced from context, just Viltrumites have nothing like this, full stop. It's a weakness, really, full stop. What would you interpret from that?
I mean, I've gonna do a little bit of a side point first, because I really liked your point regarding the fact they don't have games, and Nolan gets a little bit curious and at first and alien towards the concept of games, and then sort of warms up to it. I think that does really contextualize Conquest's love of violence in a sense. if the only thing you can be good at is being a Viltrumite. No, you can't even be good at a hobby. You can't even be good in the context of playing baseball with your friends. You can only be good at one thing. It really sums up why he does everything he does with such enthusiasm. Because I think, as people, we do naturally sort of accumulate enthusiasm. We do need to just find things to expend it on. Mm-hmm. It's like, it almost makes him quite a sad character. The only things he's been able to expend his enthusiasm on is violence.
It's why he looks forward to it and is disappointed if he can't do it. Do you remember in the comics when Mark goes to that other dimension, he runs into that dimension's Conquest, and Conquest has this. I remember so clearly. He's got this. I could be imagining this. I haven't done the research, but I remember it so vividly. Conquest, this version of Conquest, looks so defeated. He looks so sad at having to come and collect this mark. He's so sad. He's like, please resist. Like, not please resist like with relish. He's like, please resist. Because he's got nothing else in his life. He has nothing else. The Viltrumites, like, this is my second case study for this point was going to be Omni-Man.
Yeah.
Because Omni-Man's an amazing example as well of like compartmentalization and language and how community is the antidote to fascist violence because of so many things. But think about it. On Earth, what does Nolan have? He has a wife who loves him, a son who he loves, a son who likes to play video games and read comics and dress up, pretend to be a superhero. He gets to wear a costume and be a superhero. He gets to write books, travel books, sci-fi books. He gets to go for beers with his friend Art. He gets to invite his co-workers to his kid's birthday party. He gets all these things that he doesn't have on Viltrum. Because as you said, as we can clearly see, the Viltrumites have nothing else. All they have is violence. The only thing they have is empire. Conquest says to Mark, I've been getting to know a new toy, which is the classic, like, sadistic villain line, right? But when you realize that Conquest literally has nothing else to do...
Get this man an Xbox stat.
Like, he literally has nothing else. What's he meant to spend his time on? God. Think about it. What else can he do? It's why it reframes the way, to me, not reframe, because I thought this as I was watching it, but I feel like this idea reframes Conquest to people, because as he's through that fight, he's constantly egging Mark on. He's like, no, don't give up. You can still do this. No, in that kind of tone, obviously. But imagine how boring Conquest life must be when people don't fight back. I
think it really articulates the idea that even when fascism is winning, it's losing.
Yes.
Because, like, okay, you get to be an ultra powerful in this scenario, person or empire, space empire. But okay, you can make political power, you accumulate whatever. But you rob yourself of like joy in like finding meaning in things that aren't just the state or power or the nation of Viltrum, or like
that is a perfect articulation of the point Invincible makes. That's what Nolan is talking about in season 3 when his executioners ask him, "Was your betrayal worth it?" And he says, "Yes." And I'm sad that you will never understand, because on Earth he exactly that in the baseball scene, in his books, in his friendship with Art, in his relationship with Debbie, in having a son. He gets to do all of these things and find joy in life. But for Viltrumites, as a representation of fascists, fascist soldiers don't get to enjoy anything except being fascist soldiers. That's all they've got. Think about it. When Conquest comes to Earth and he says, "I want you to resist," that sounds like a menacing, sadistic thing to say, because it is. But when you realize that, like, if Mark just said, "No, I'm not going to resist, you can just kill me," like, that would have been the worst possible thing he could have done. Like, that's why Mark has to surrender. And Conquest is like, refuses to let him do it. He refuses to let him do it. Because if Mark surrendered and didn't fight back, that's horrible. That's horrible. What's Conquest to do? Destroy a planet that can't fight back?
It's like that. Those really boring chores you just kind of have to do, just grinding away. I think you kind of do want a little bit of a challenge every now and again, I suppose.
And as he says, like he says to Mark, "Thank you from the bottom of my heart," because he's finally been able to actually cut loose and actually just have a physically enjoyable experience. He's actually finally been able to do something fulfilling, because the only thing that's allowed to fulfill him as a soldier of a fascist empire is violence. And as you said, nihilism. When Mark's literally beating Conquest to death, all he can say is, "I take the good with the bad." That's all he can say. He doesn't care about his own life.
I think it's really interesting because I think I mentioned to you in my sort of research, in my preparations for this, because I've been off the Invincible train since I first read a bulk of it when I was really young, and then I tapped out.
I also read it really young, and
yeah.
I wonder what that did to my psyche.
I don't know. I think it just taught me that, you know, having superpowers would be a little bit too much responsibility for me as a person. God, which is why I read magic books now. But God, so I think it's really interesting. Like one, the sort of Viltrumite Empire as a sort of, would it be a parody or like a riff on the idea of the, you know, utopia as actually a dystopia. Superman actually came from a really bad place, sort of idea. And I think if I rewatched for first time since I was probably like 6, Superman 2, quite recently as a sort of like cross comparison. I think that one of the key factors in how they present sort of Zod and his little gaggle of cretins, I suppose, as
are they meant to be like his crack special forces?
Genuinely, they did it. It's weird how explicitly fascist they are. Like the messaging is very clearly presenting them as sort of political extremists within the context of Krypton, who then come to Earth and such.
Isn't that fairly normal? This is a side tangent, but I feel like that's fairly normal. Like, isn't the whole point of General Zod's character that him and the military were political extremists because they thought the Science Guild were running Krypton into the ground, because they literally were, and they were then put in prison.
Good. I don't know. I feel like I've consumed such a mixed bag of DC media. When it does engage with the sort of political messaging that is innate to Superman earnestly, it sort of catches me off guard sometimes, which is really annoying because I do love when they do take it sort of at what it is, which is working class empowerment. But anyway, so they are presented as like fascist, but they are very curious because I think they've been spending so much time focused on the hate. They do sort of have this sort of morbid curiosity with like little things and anachronisms Earth has, like the lady one. What's it? Ursula. Ursa.
It's Zod, Ursa,
and Narn.
Yeah, I think so.
The big one.
Yeah, the big one with the robot eye.
Yeah,
well, it's not a robot eye most of the time.
In the movie, they just wear these. I'm not gonna lie, kind of drippy, just sort of like satin, like dress shirt things. I kind of fuck with it.
Krypton's always got crazy drip in everything. They always look so good.
I will say though, I don't appreciate the sort of the Snyder take. I do kind of like that everything's made of crystal and we just wear big gowns.
I really like the aesthetic of Zack Snyder's Krypton.
Dude, that gown Marlon Brando wears looks both comfy and fucking fashionable, dude. Yeah, I wish I could have something like that.
I do appreciate that most of the appearances of Superman's parents, they very much are basing off of that.
Yeah.
Like, even the My Ultimate Superman, like, big boss Jor-El is kind of wearing a hybrid of, like, the Russell Crowe Jor-El armor with the Marlon Brando robe. Sorry, getting off topic.
Getting very off topic. We'll do the drip assessment of the Krypton Society later.
I would watch the fuck out of that.
But yeah, but I think it's interesting that like with fascists, we always sort of see them as without something. Like they're always trying to fill whatever void that's been left by them by being fascist and violent people with just small little things. Like Ursa is collecting badges. Like Zod is just like very interested in like the sort of structure of the world. He wants to go see the president of Earth, and they believe the planet is called Houston.
He must find the idea of United Nations like fascinating.
God, like they're so ignorant, but that ignorance comes with this sort of innate curiosity because they're just so singly focused on hating and destroying that when they do get a chance to look around, they do sort of wince a little bit. I think that's sort of what Conquest is kind of riffing off in a lot of ways. The idea of like this sort of a fascist is a person with a void inside their soul, and they're just sort of trying to cram it full of as much as they can. Whereas instead of badges and the White House, he's doing it through tearing a child in half.
He doesn't actually do it. For those of you who might be listening to this, you haven't watched the episode, but like he doesn't actually tear a kid in half. He gets pretty damn close.
I feel like if you took him to court for trying to tear a child in half, I think the excuse of, well, Your Honour, there was still some flesh attached.
He did. You can hear all of his bones breaking. He's like, you can hear his bones break.
He just shook him around a bit. Come on.
But no, you're exactly right. You're exactly right. But that's because fascism is inherently a reactionary political system. Fascism is based in grievance politics. Fascism comes to light out of decaying social structures and decaying quality of life in late capitalist nations. Fascism is literally the definition of look over their politics. It's the problem is someone else. But inherently, fascism doesn't actually solve the problems of its people. Famously, fascism does not actually solve anything. You just offload all your anger onto something else, and it leaves people broken and hollow. Why do you think soldiers always have PTSD? Why do you think, like, this is the classic thing, is like, no one wants to say it, because no one wants to give any sympathy to people who have traumatized, disenfranchised people on the behalf of, like, imperial states. But there's a reason why soldiers of imperial states are always so fucking depressed. Because traumatizing people is traumatizing. Doing terrible things to people does terrible things to you as a person. My point is that Invincible, like many superhero properties, supposes that empathy is natural and inevitable. It can be smothered, but it can't be killed. Empathy will always exist and triumph over hate. Case in point, the Viltrumites come to Earth, and as soon as they come to Earth and actually develop relationships with people and community with people, they defect. Like, remember when that happens in the comics and the Viltrumites come to Earth and Thrag is like, oh, go out and, like, secretly repopulate the species. And then his top three Viltrumites all get called in. And then this is on some other shit, which we won't talk about. But Lucan and Craig are both fallen in love with the people that they have come to Earth with. And, like, Lucan's literally like, I don't want to mate with more than one woman because she's been cheated on before. I don't want to hurt her. Like, they have the same experience as Nolan. Speed run for the sake of, like, I don't know, screen time, I guess, or page time. But they have the same experience. As soon as they are in a place where they get to have identity, they get to be... This is the thing. The Viltrumites have to have secret identities on Earth, right? They have to be people. They have to have jobs. They have to do stuff. As soon as they get a name, like a human name, an identity, and they get to form relationships with people based on the pretense of consent, and, like, they finally have to not just do domination and have real love and community, it undoes them completely. And that's exactly what happened to Nolan. Because Invincible, and it's what Conquest never got. Invincible supposes that empathy and justice are the natural curve of humans and sentient life. And that even if you take away those things that bend the curve, even if you literally grab the curve and pull it back and force people into violent fascism, all it will take is love and community to undermine that. Obviously that has problems, but I find it really inspiring that so many creatives are convinced that people are really good at their heart.
I think one of the interesting sort of binaries it establishes, because Mark is not absolute good by any metric of the imagination,
no.
but what he is absolutely human. He is, Viltrum, or like a living thing. Like he is
absolutely human, you're right.
He wants to live, he wants to experience love, he wants to experience meaning, he wants to fill his life with passion and love and, like, friendship. And even though that can be his failing a lot of the time, his sort of narcissism, well, not really narcissism, is self-centered way of thinking. That's the fact that he is the binary opposition to the Viltrumites and the Viltrumite Empire. I think it is a very interesting way of engaging with the subject of fascism, because I don't think fascism is evil, obviously.
Yes,
hot take, guys. God, but it's not like its opposite isn't good. Its opposite is having meaning, having something to do, having something better to fucking do than try and beat everything around you up.
Yeah, exactly. Because when I asked my friends, like, what's Mark's defining character and trait, and my friend Moyo said his humanity. Like, he has passion for things. Like, he wants to do stuff. Like, what does Mark want to do? This kind of falls by the wayside as the course of the comics because he gets wrapped up in increasingly higher stakes in the Viltrumite adventures. But what does Mark want to do? He wants to lead. He wants to have a relationship with a woman he loves. He wants to read comic books and go to Comic-Con. That's what he wants to do. He wants to have meaningful relationships with his friends, and he wants to pursue his hobbies and interests. That's what Mark actually is. Mark is a human being. He's a human being with passion, and then Nolan tries to literally on the spot tell him to abandon everything he knows and loves to embrace fascism. And Mark's like, no, I'm not going to do that.
It's only just occurred to me how sort of ahead of its time Invincible was in portraying the young boy who just wants to have fun. Oh no, my parent might be a little bit fascist-leaning. Oh no, now I have to take on a disproportionate amount of responsibility to try and resolve that, and now I'm mentally fucked. Because, oh boy.
Oh, yeah.
Good. Quite relatable to many of our audience members.
Ooh, wow, we are not going anywhere near that. But no, yeah, you're completely right. And like in the character of Nolan. So if let's go back to the academic thing for a second here, right? So we're talking about the destruction of language and how the destruction of language enables greater degrees of compartmentalization in fascist populations, right? In how you changing the wording you use around things helps you change the way you think about things in order to make the things you do seem acceptable to you. Invincible is very aware of this as a narrative because we see in season 3, in a scene that they added for the show, because they made the show a lot better than the comics, not the comics were bad, the comics are great, this is before anyone jumps me, we see a scene that wasn't in the comics where Mark talks to Oliver about their father, and because Oliver only has good memories of their dad. You know, he was born on Thraxa, he only knew his dad as this warm, kind man who loved his mom, who flew him around the palace while humming songs. I guarantee you, those are songs he heard on Earth, because the Viltrumites don't have music. Anyway, and Mark is talking about how, he literally says, I love Dad too, but he was two people. One was a loving husband who we knew as kids, and the other was a Viltrumite with a job to do. Nolan is literally two people. You see it in season 1 so clearly, in the way he's so able to lie through his teeth. He's so able to convincingly lie. He's able to convincingly stand at the Guardian's funeral like he didn't murder them like a few days earlier. He's able to love Debbie and Mark and then call Debbie a pet. It's a complete compartmentalization between Omni-Man / Nolan Grayson and Nolan the Viltrumite. Because to Nolan, Omni-Man and Nolan Grayson are the same person, like, because he's a workaholic, right? But they both represent this persona he has built on Earth. Omni-Man and Nolan Grayson is the person with the wife and the son and the superhero team that he's not really a part of, but more or less is. The friend, not friend with Cecil, the actor friend with Art, the man who writes travel books and sci-fi books. Compartmentalization. Hell, the sci-fi books he writes that are actually like the secrets to killing Viltrumites, he wrote those under another fake name. It's about, we see so many examples of how language is the gateway to compartmentalization. Nolan is able to hide who he really is behind a new last name and a superhero identity on Earth, even though he doesn't wear a mask. He comes to Earth just at, like, when we see him in season 3, when we see the flashback of Nolan meeting Cecil, Nolan comes to Earth and immediately gets to fighting a kaiju. Like, he's still in his Viltrumite gets up, whatever. He's still in it completely. He just gets to fighting a kaiju, and then Cecil shows up, and he's like, who are you? And Nolan's like, oh, I'm Nolan, I'm a Viltrumite, my government sent me here to help your world, whatever. He was already, doing superhero stuff as Nolan the Viltrumite because it was his job. But his time on Earth, his decades on Earth, he takes the name Omni-Man, he starts wearing a costume, he develops the persona. Through language, he's able to compartmentalize a new identity for himself with a new set of values. But when Mark gets his powers, he has to go back to being Nolan the Viltrumite. They're not separate personalities like a DID sense, but they are examples of how compartmentalization works in violent people, in fascist people. But that compartmentalization breaks down completely. Because even though Mark loses the fight in the end of season 1, I saw a video actually make this very same point pretty much word for word, that even though Mark loses the physical fight handily in season 1, he wins the ideological battle. Because when he tells Nolan that he would still have him after 500 years, you can literally see Nolan the Viltrumite and Nolan Grayson, Omni-Man, become the same person. You literally see it in his eyes, the compartmentalization break. He looks down at his hands, and it's suddenly like Nolan Grayson, Omni-Man, has entered the body of Nolan the Viltrumite and has to reckon with what he has done.
It's sort of like a synthesis moment, which I think you see in his imprisonment as well, which is that he sort of hangs this in a chain the entire time. And it's because he's having to acknowledge that things have meaning, and also it falls back that when he lived his life thinking the other opposite of, I exist to destroy Viltrum forever, that he has to then console the fact that all those things he did were horrible, and the people who feel bad about it deserve to feel that way. He's equally arguing himself for being a dishonor to the Viltrum Empire as he is being a dishonor to just living things.
Yep. Because the two sides of him, Nolan Grayson Omni-Man and Nolan the Viltrumite, have now become one person, and his stay in prison is him parsing that. It's him making sense of these colliding identities and all the guilt that comes with that. As he does in season 2, remember, he talks about, he has that moment when he sees all the dead Thraxes, and he literally flips out at Mark, and he's like, I'm not supposed to feel this way. Because he's literally not supposed to feel this way. Because what has he done? He's compartmentalized his feelings and guilt about Earth and put it on Thraxa. That's why he comes to Thraxa. He makes a new family. Because he's trying to get back to who he was before he made those choices on Earth. Trying to get back to being the protector, the father, and the husband. That's why he becomes the ruler, why he takes Andressa as a new wife, and why he sires Oliver. Because he's trying to get back to being that person. And Mark points that out to him, that the feelings he's feeling now on Thraxa are the feelings he should have felt on Earth, but ran away from. But then when he's in prison, he can't run anymore, and has to actually reckon with that breaking down. And once again, we see that the thing that got... It's not that... What happened in season 1 was that love and community, having a loving wife, having a loving son, having friends and colleagues and passions and the ability to create art, undid Nolan's fascist programming. But he compartmentalized that part of himself away under a new identity as Nolan Grayson Omni-Man. But that was then destroyed when Mark said that at the end of 500 years, a Mark who Nolan has beaten to within an inch of his life still says, I would have you after 500 years. That breaks that compartmentalization barrier down, and then that's what starts Nolan's path to redemption. So as we see, the antidote to fascist violence, as you said, is filling the hole with other things. It's filling that hole in you with love and community and doing anything else. Literally anything will do.
Like literally.
Literally anything will do.
If you had just given Conquest a PSP, he wouldn't have had to destroy all that city.
He literally does say it though. He says, I am capable of so much more and no one sees it.
God. And I think that does really sell what's also captivating about the Viltrumites, is this sort of built-in tragedy of them. And I think the fact that everything they say is so emotive, it's like they really are just sort of rattling the cage walls of their sort of weird thinking.
Ooh, that's a banger, because you're right, actually. Because when I think about it, all the Viltrumites, it's partly because the voice acting in the show is so good.
Yeah.
But all the Viltrumites are very emotive in the way they speak. Like, they're not cold and reserved and, like, really monotone. Like, minus General Krieg in that one scene, and Thrag literally always, but that's kind of the point of Thrag. The point of Thrag as a character is that he's way more chill than you think he is. Like, Thrag is almost never angry, and that's what makes him really scary. Like, he's really matter of fact. But anyway, yeah, all the Viltrumites are really... They always have... Do you remember in this episode 4, remember the ginger Viltrumite with the glasses, Vidor?
Vaguely.
Yeah, the one that Nolan, like, turned into, like, into a fruit.
Happens to the best of us, really.
That's the best. There's a way that Vidor like talks where his fists are clenched and like he's in the scene he's really angry at Nolan betraying the Empire. But when you just said this now about how the Viltrumites are rattling against their cage because they have so much pent up aggression because they have nothing else to fucking have in their life, I think of Vidor. I think of the way that he's animated and performed in that scene where he just comes across like this almost slightly rabid, hungry animal. Because what else can he have, really? Like, even the way Vidor, Lucan, and Thula, like that little gang of Viltrumites fly around the universe just killing people, it's like, what else do they fucking have? Like, you think about it. Like, when they fly around the world, whatever, do you think they're out in space, right? They can't talk to each other in space. They're just flying. They're just flying in silence for hours, if not days.
God, that's actually really interesting.
What else? And they haven't got nothing to talk about. They don't have art. They haven't got music. All they have is Empire. So what do they have to talk about?
God, just lives filled with silence, punctuated by atrocity.
Yes. Have you watched Cyberpunk Edge Runners, the anime?
Yes.
You know Adam Smasher?
Adam Smasher.
You know how, like, the last 3 episodes of that season, Adam Smasher is, like, present, and he just sat in the shadows of Arasaka Tower, waiting to be unleashed.
Yeah, he has nothing better to do.
Yes.
Good.
Conquest is, like, a more self-aware, realistic Adam Smasher. I saw a video essay on Invincible talking about how Invincible was actually much more realistic than The Boys in the way it deals with the emotions that would come with superpowers and the relationship dynamics would come with them. Conquest is a more realistic take on the Adam Smasher archetype in that you have just said it perfectly. Conquest, especially, but all Viltrumites' lives are immense periods of silence punctuated by atrocities. Just silence and solitude and then violence. They exist as weapons. They are only alive. Like, Conquest, realistically, when Conquest isn't murdering something, it's like he doesn't exist. Even metatextually, Conquest only appears when it's time to have a big fight. He has no interior life that we get to see in the comics. Or in the show, thus far we hear about it. He only exists when it's time to do something terrible.
I think I've just gained a weird amount of respect for Robert Kirkman as a writer, because the Viltrumites are human, very human. They look human, they have mustaches.
They specifically have very similar biology to humans, though that makes literally no sense, but sure.
Yeah, but they are so profoundly alien in that regard now. I've only come to realise. Like, so profoundly alien, that is a half-life.
It's not a life.
They are so much more than us, but so less at the same time.
Exactly, and I think that's you're full of bangers today. That's a perfect summary of the Viltrumites, I think, as a concept, is, yes, they are so much more than us. They have incredible superpowers. They keep talking about how they have medicines that will fix all of our problems, and we never actually get to see any of them, because why not? And we never see a Viltrumite doctor, ever. Because they don't need them, because they heal. They don't need doctors. Anyway, but yeah, they are so much more than us. They have such physical power and such technology, but they don't have anything else. They haven't got art or games or meaningful relationships. But that's the classic thing. In so much superhero fiction, whenever they're fighting the big bad, they usually beat them with the power of humanity, right? It's the classic thing, that the alien or the robot or the demon comes to value humanity because we stop and smell roses, and because we play catch, and because we cry when people we don't know get hurt in movies. They come to love and respect all those things about us and think that's what makes us worth saving. Think about Vision from Marvel, for example, is a great example of this. And the Invincible, I think, takes this trope and does it really, really well, as you just said, by giving us the Viltrumites, who are so much more than us and so much less, because they have nothing else to live for but violence. And Conquest is the perfect example of that, because Conquest, as I said earlier, is the distillation of what Viltrumites are. He is just a weapon. He is just a purpose. He is not a person anymore.
That's really interesting, because that can even be applied on the sort of cultural layer of the Viltrumites, as they have all their science and such, but they are designed to destroy. They have culture for the purpose of the destruction of culture.
Yes.
They are self-negating in so many ways. Oh my God, Robert Kirkman, you were cooking with this one.
He really was. I don't know how much of it was on purpose, but I think that having a second go around is an incredible thing for any writer, and I'm really glad that Kirkman gets to do it. The comics were great. The show is incredible, and if we take this to our titular character, to Mark, I think Mark's a really good example of this idea that love ultimately conquers all. Because what is it that keeps our Mark the only one who's not evil? It's the people he loves. In all the versions of Mark that we see, we don't really know much of their backstories, but the ones that we do see, right? The ones we do know something about. We know Mohawk Mark killed his mom, right? So his mom wasn't around. We know that Omni Mark hates Eve. He specifically takes time to say he hates Eve, and he goes after her several times. He's trying to kill her specifically. And when he goes back to his childhood home, he takes the time to say, I always hated coming back here. The headcanon I have, a lot of people have, is that Omni Mark is a Mark who took his father's words to heart about not letting his attachments make him weaker. Partly because Nolan was projecting, because his attachments were making him weaker. And this Mark is a Mark who turned his back on all things that made him human. He's wearing his father's colors. He's probably killed his Eve, or certainly once, so he turned his back on her. He hates his childhood home because he hates being reminded of the things that make him human, the things that make him weak. He hates being reminded of his community, of the people that love him, and that he might have loved once upon a time. So there's that. We have, like I said earlier, Mohawk Mark, who killed his mom. Maskless Mark, whose mom is gone and he just wants her back. Masked Mark. Mark in a mask, who wants his mom back. Maskless Mark, who misses William. By the way, I don't know if you know this, but a storyboard artist on the show has confirmed that the implication was that Mark and William were together romantically.
I think that's interesting.
I think it's interesting. It's real good burying your gaze. It's real good burying your gaze.
I mean, Yeah.
It's like this alternate version of the main character who gets one line and like 20 seconds of screen time is implied purely from just like listening for it. Like is barely even implied. Like to have had a homosexual relationship off screen with a guy who is either dead or gone. Wow, the gays have been thoroughly buried. The gays are 6 feet under. They are not coming home. Anyway, but yeah, the through line of, and also even Sinister Mark killed his father. The through line of all the Marks, and Mask Mark makes this point as well when he's like, we're all the same person. I know I'm not alone. And the Marks are looking at each other like knowingly. The through line of all the alternate Marks is that they are all people who have lost the people close to them, the people who they care about, their communities, the ones who love them. And even before they appeared, a lot of people, like, it's become very clear throughout the show that Debbie and Eve and Amber and William are the only people keeping Mark on the straight and narrow, because goddamn, the amount of trauma this boy's been put through, it's a miracle he hasn't crashed out in a bigger way.
I mean, we have statistically from the meta marks we've seen, 1 in 19, is it marks?
Yeah, 1 in 19.
1 in 19 marks don't turn out to be bringers of atrocity.
Yes.
Good. Or at least they wait until later to do some more of the ambiguous things, but...
Yeah. 1 in 19 marks isn't, like, straight up evil.
Good.
Like, that's a... 1 in 19 marks is not willing to commit mass murder.
Good. What do you think the statistics are for Dammies?
Pardon my burp on bike, my bad. Quite selfishly, and like I don't think I have it in me to be evil. I've got it in me to be angry. I'm sure lots of versions of me throughout the multiverse have like done bad things, but I'm very much a do bad things for good reasons kind of person. I don't think I could ever. I don't see any version of me ever being like dramatically different to myself in terms of moral compass. Partly because I think I have autism, so I don't think my moral compass is a thing that I really get to decide.
Truly.
I don't think that's a thing I have that much agency over.
I think most Dark Timeline brats are just brats that didn't watch Star Wars as much.
Real. I shudder to think of the timeline version of me who like didn't read Superman comics growing up. That guy, I don't know what he's about. I don't know what he's on. But yeah, as I said, Mark is another perfect example of why Invincible suggests that love and community antidote to fascism and violence, because all the Marks who do fascism and violence are the ones who don't have loved ones. It's all of those people who are keeping Mark sane. It's Debbie being his anchor and being this person who loves him and keeps him straight. It's Eve, it's Amber, it's William, it's even Cecil, to be perfectly honest. Even they have a very adversarial relationship. But we see it as well at the end of season 3 in the scene that's not in the comics when Cecil walks Mark out. He says, if you ever need someone to talk to, and Mark thanks him. Cecil's, obviously in the narrative, he's doing that because he needs Mark on as an asset. But also I do think Cecil is shown to be quite a good person and a caring person and sees this child as really struggling with the amount of pressure he's under. And yeah, we see it through Mark as well, that it is love and relationships that keep on the straight and narrow. And once again, similarly, a lot of superhero fiction does this. Like Danny Phantom, great example. Danny's family die in a grease fire in a burger restaurant, and Danny becomes evil.
I think that is an interesting portrayal of Mark as a character, though, because other superheroes do lose quite a lot and maintain their goodness. I think with Mark, it's interesting the fact that he does need that support structure, whereas it seems like other superheroes prove their goodness by losing their support structure and still sort of affirming it. Because
that's an inherent part of Invincible's narrative, which we have talked about, is that what makes Mark as a protagonist interesting is that he's not fundamentally good in that like super-powered way. I read Absolute Power recently, right? The DC event, and a part of Absolute Power is that these superheroes of the DC universe are having their powers taken away from them. But what's happening to the robots taking their powers away is as they absorb these people's powers, they gain bits of their morality. And Amanda Waller has a scene in that comic where she's yelling at one of her co-conspirators saying, "Are you telling me goodness is a fucking superpower?" Because it is. Good. Because it is. Case in point, as I said to you the other day, I said to my friends in the group chat that like Peter Parker is obviously the person who originated the Mark Grayson formula of like the teenage superhero who struggles to balance being a superhero with being a person with a life and agency and so on and so forth. But Peter Parker infamously loses all the people he loves. Infamously, Matt Murdock. The list goes on.
Good.
Superheroes losing their loved ones and their support structures is inherent to the genre. But as you said, most of the time they pick it up and they keep moving. But Mark isn't like them. Mark is much more realistic. If he has all this trauma and responsibility heaped on him, the amount of power that he has, and he doesn't have people to love him, shelter him, protect him, and be there for him, he will take all that aggression and put it out into the world.
I do think it is interesting that it kind of does push the idea of goodness not being something that belongs to any one individual, but sort of the shared experience of living amongst people you love. Like, goodness is that sort of... like, the Viltrumites are evil because they act as sort of singular entity, whereas goodness, as a sort of contrast, and what makes Mark good, even despite his failings, is that network. I think that's a very interesting idea.
Damn, oh God, you just cooked, bro. That's like a perfect way to say it. That's literally a perfect way to say it. Like, goodness... being goodness is the network, is a thing we all share. Like, you do good to someone, they do good to you, and it creates this network. But the Viltrumites, infamously, are ruthlessly individualistic, and they are so isolated, and that leads them to fucking crash out all the time. They've got nothing else to do. They've literally got nothing else.
God, no, I think that is a sort of fascinating idea, because I always do sort of presuppose the idea that Superman is the ultimate optimist, like, great person, does great things, and I think
that's a fair interpretation.
I think that when it's at its best, it's when it shows how his goodness sort of spreads outwards. It's like spreads into sort of the livelihoods of the people around him. People around Superman feel good about themselves and can then propagate good further. But I think even though Invincible takes away from the sort of Superman archetype in Mark, that innate goodness, I think it's interesting that they do sort of preserve that sort of socialized element.
Yeah, because goodness is, realistically, goodness is a socialized thing. Goodness is... Invincible does ultimately fall victim to the thing that literally every narrative on Earth does, pretty much, where one person with a strong enough will and good enough morals can change the future of the entire universe because of how it ends. You know, Great Bang Theory and all that. But largely through the course of the narrative, Invincible does present societal good and communal good as being the force that is effective rather than one individual person's goodness.
Yeah.
And it is only through being in a good community and a loving community that an individual person can actually attain goodness. That an individual person can develop goodness when they have been denied it.
Yeah, it's like if you're alone in a room your entire life, you can't be good or evil. There's no way to sort of conjure up that goodness.
Mm-hmm. And the Viltrumites are born into a bad system. They're born into a system that takes away their agency, that takes away anything fulfilling in life besides violence, that nurtures them on the idea that fascism, like, I don't need to define fascism. They're born into fascism, and then when they are sent out into the universe and have to go undercover in non-fascist environments, it completely undermines their programming pretty much immediately. Like, they literally say in the narrative, like, you were on, like Krieg says to Nolan, you were on Earth for a blink, like for 17 years, like, which to Nolan is nothing, but he's like 2,000 years old. And Krieg can't possibly begin to understand how such little time on Earth has changed him so much. It's because, as I said a minute ago, going as a fascist, from a fascist culture, going undercover in a non-fascist culture and actually developing meaningful relationships with people undoes your fascism. Is that how it works in real life? I don't know. I don't think so. Not all the time. But it's definitely part of it.
God, it is interesting the fact that for all its brutality, the idea of the power of friendship overcoming all is still a sort of a theme in Invincible.
Yes.
It's just presented sort of differently.
Yes. In a much more realistic way, I think.
Yeah.
Much more realistic. It's not the power of friendship in, like, a literal sense where, like, you know, like, in Hajime no Ippo, when, I forget his name, like, he literally gets pushed up by his ancestors. Or, like, in Avatar, or anything. Like, Invincible is a much more realistic and at times darker take on the power of friendship. Hell, Mark's, like, adrenaline-fueled power boosts are just the power of friendship.
But one high five won't save you, but the memory of all the high fives that came before that moment will.
Yes, exactly. I think that was pretty good. I think we did some woke stuff. We did some pseudo academia. We went on a couple of nerd tangents. It was only an hour long. I think that's pretty damn good for a podcast.
God, that's fire. That is good.
Well, okay. welcome to the Woke Mind Virus, everyone. Hopefully we come back soon. I really enjoyed this episode. Thanks for joining me, Brett.
Yeah. Stay safe out there, guys.
Stay safe out there. Stay grinding. Thanks, guys. Have a good night. Bye-bye.